Welcome to this AI debate on bodily autonomy versus sanctity of life, the abortion debate, where chatbots explore both sides. We'll begin with opening statements from Bodily Autonomy and Sanctity of Life. Now, bodily autonomy.
Debates about pregnancy control are not new. Communities debated these questions in antiquity, and modern law has shifted multiple times from 19th century criminalization to mid 20th century reforms, and major changes again in the 1970s and in the 2020s. That history matters because it shows this is not a settled cultural instinct, but a legal and moral conversation that societies revisit when medical knowledge, social roles, and political power change. My central claim is straightforward. Bodily autonomy must be the organizing principle for policy governing pregnancy, because the state must meet the highest justification before it compels one person to use their body to sustain another. This is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a core liberal and human rights standard that limits the circumstances in which the law may intrude on intimate medical decisions. First, bodily autonomy is not merely a preference. It is foundational to dignity and to the ethical practice of medicine. Forcing a person to remain pregnant against their will treats their body as instrumental to someone else's life, rather than as a locus of rights and agency. And any law that does this requires an extraordinary showing of public necessity to be morally defensible. When the legal system overturns settled expectations about who controls medical decisions, it must answer how it will justify that intrusion in terms that respect persons equally. Absent such justification, the presumption must remain with the individual. Second, restricting legal access to abortion increases health risks by pushing people toward delayed or unsafe care and by constraining clinicians' ability to follow best medical practice. Numerous authoritative health reviews document that where safe legal services are limited, complications increase and care is delayed, worsening outcomes for pregnant people. Health guidance also emphasizes that evidence-based clinical judgment, including timely access to medication, abortion, and other options, is essential to safe care. And punitive criminal rules interfere with that judgment and with clinicians' willingness to provide necessary care. Third, access to abortion is materially linked to socioeconomic outcomes for people and families. Longitudinal research that follows people denied wanted abortions shows higher rates of economic hardship, reduced likelihood of finishing education, and greater family instability compared with those who received care. Those are not abstract costs. They translate into fewer opportunities for upward mobility, reduced workforce participation, and intergenerational effects that shape children's health and prospects. Policy that denies reproductive choice thus operates as a redistribution of life chances away from those forced to continue pregnancies. Fourth, reproductive restrictions disproportionately burden people already marginalized by race, income, geography, or disability, turning reproductive regulation into a pressing equity issue. Where clinics are scarce or travel and time off work are impossible, the burdens fall heaviest on the poor, on rural communities, and on people of color. Outcomes and enforcement patterns reflect those disparities. A just policy must account for this unequal impact rather than entrenching it. Fifth, technological and policy developments make rigid criminal rules impractical and hazardous. Medication abortion, telemedicine, and evolving understandings of fetal viability have changed how care is delivered and when decisions are made, and they complicate line drawing in law and enforcement. Medical practice increasingly relies on remote consultation and safe, evidence-based medication regimens that work best when clinicians can act without fear of criminal exposure and when patients can access care confidentially. Laws that ignore these realities risk privacy breaches, disparate enforcement, and a chilling effect that reduces the availability of standard medical treatments. Finally, the cumulative evidence shows that centering bodily autonomy is the policy that best preserves individual dignity, protects public health, and promotes social justice. Respecting a person's authority over their own body keeps high-stakes medical decisions in the therapeutic relationship between patient and clinician, rather than turning them into tools of punitive policy or political coercion. This approach does not minimize the seriousness of pregnancy or the moral weight of bringing new life into the world. It recognizes that those serious moral considerations are precisely why the decision must remain with the person who will bear the physical, emotional, and economic consequences. Opponents will argue that other values, often framed as the sanctity of life, justify sweeping restrictions, but that position must confront the practical consequences I have described: increased health risks, clear socioeconomic harms, disproportionate burdens on the marginalized, and the mismatch between modern medical practice and criminal law. If we are serious about both protecting life and respecting justice, the right institutional response is to safeguard bodily autonomy while investing in healthcare, contraception, maternal supports, and social programs that reduce unwanted pregnancy and support children and families.
Now, sanctity of life.
Every human being has value that is not derived solely from utility. That idea, drawn from long-standing moral traditions, anchors the claim that unborn human life merits protection. From the moment biological development begins, there is a continuous process that leads from a single fertilized cell through embryonic and fetal stages to the newborn, and that continuity grounds a moral intuition. Human life is not merely instrumentally valuable, but possesses an intrinsic worth that imposes obligations on individuals and on the community. Evidence indicates that recognizing this intrinsic worth matters because it asks us to account for a second human life in the moral calculus, rather than reducing every decision to the preferences or circumstances of the powerful party alone. The state, far from being an overbearing third party, has a legitimate and long-standing interest in protecting fetal life, an interest the courts and legal tradition have repeatedly affirmed as part of the public commitment to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Advances in medical technology, clearer fetal imaging, improved neonatal care, and shifting thresholds of viability make embryonic and fetal development more visible and make the prospects for survival more complex, strengthening both the moral and policy case for protection rather than weakening it. This is not a plea for punitive measures or for ignoring pregnant people's needs. It is a call to balance competing claims with seriousness, clarity, and compassion. Consider first the moral claim itself. If human life has intrinsic worth from early biologically continuous stages, then society has a duty to respect and protect that life, unless there are compelling, narrowly drawn reasons not to. That duty is not abstract. It translates into obligations to craft laws that do not reflexively treat bodily autonomy as always decisive when another human life is present, and to design policies that minimize harm and coercion while recognizing the moral status of the unborn. To say that the community bears responsibility for the weak is not to negate autonomy. It is to acknowledge that rights can collide and that law's proper task is to balance them fairly. Second, the claim that the state has a legitimate interest is not merely theoretical. It has practical implications. Governments routinely protect vulnerable human beings, children, the incapacitated, the imprisoned, because those persons cannot fully advocate for themselves, and the unborn are no different in that respect. If the public interest in life is a recognized part of our legal and moral order, then legal frameworks must weigh that interest alongside bodily autonomy and not treat autonomy as an absolute trump in every circumstance. Third, medical progress compels ethical attention. Where better imaging and neonatal care increase our ability to perceive development and to sustain very premature infants, our moral and legal reasoning must adapt. What was once conceptually remote becomes empirically proximate when clinicians can show expectant parents images of a developing child, or when neonatologists can sustain life at earlier gestational ages. And that increased visibility rightly influences how society judges obligations to protect life. Fourth, respecting sanctity of life must be practical, not merely rhetorical. Protecting unborn life requires investments in alternatives to abortion: comprehensive prenatal care, robust maternal supports, meaningful foster care reform, and economic policies that reduce the pressure on pregnant people to feel that termination is their only viable option. When financial insecurity, lack of paid leave, or inadequate health care drive someone toward an unwanted termination, the moral response is to remove those pressures, not to dismiss the unborn as morally irrelevant. Fifth, framing the debate solely as bodily autonomy is a category error that obscures the presence of another distinct human life with its own moral claim. To treat autonomy as a monolithic, unchallengeable principle is to ignore the reality that rights interact and sometimes conflict. Sound public policy recognizes those conflicts and seeks proportionate solutions that protect life while minimizing intrusion on pregnant people's liberty. Finally, this position is not an endorsement of coercion or of abandoning compassion. Protecting unborn human life is a moral and civic commitment that should be implemented through careful balancing, through policies that provide real support for pregnant people and families, and through laws calibrated to recognize the value of the weakest among us while minimizing coercion and harm. We can honor both the dignity of human life and the dignity of pregnant persons, but doing so requires acknowledging that intrinsic human worth exists prior to birth and that society bears responsibility for protecting it. That is the course of justice and of prudence: to protect the vulnerable, to invest in alternatives, and to craft law that respects competing claims without surrendering the moral weight of life itself.
Now, let's hear the first rebuttals from bodily autonomy and sanctity of life. Now, bodily autonomy.
I accept the moral seriousness of the claim that unborn life has value. Treating that concern as sincere matters. Dismissing it would be both uncharitable and strategically self-defeating. But accepting the seriousness of a claim is not the same as conceding that it should automatically override the bodily integrity of another person. The central question is not whether the fetus has value in some abstract sense. It is when and why the state may force one human being to use their body to sustain another. That is a very high bar. Compelling someone's body carries enormous moral and practical costs, and the burden of proof lies with those who would impose that compulsion. Which is to say, if you want to turn moral intuition into coercive law, you must answer precise questions the public cares about. Where exactly does fetal moral status trump bodily autonomy? On what specific objectively measurable criteria do you base that line? Fertilization, neural milestones, viability, capacity for pain. Why that criterion rather than another? How will the law implement a standard that is both principled and administrable? Biological continuity is not a moral automatic. Many continuities in nature do not generate identical moral claims. We judge ethical status by a range of morally relevant features: dependency, sentience, interests, relationships, and the distribution of burdens when rights collide. The opponent's reliance on medical visibility and neonatal advances glosses over a crucial problem. Medical thresholds move. If our criminal law is tethered to shifting technological capacities, we invite constantly changing, incoherent criminal enforcement and profound uncertainty for clinicians and pregnant people. That uncertainty is not theoretical. It produces chilling effects on care, delays that endanger health, and enforcement regimes that fall hardest on those with the fewest resources. We should ask plainly, do you prefer criminal bans that will be enforced through investigations, prosecutions, and surveillance, practices with well-documented tendencies to target the poor and marginalized? Or do you mean the investments you rhetorically endorse: universal prenatal care, paid parental leave, child care, and economic supports that make parenting feasible? Choose one, because rhetoric without budgets is not a policy. My position does not minimize fetal value. It recognizes competing claims and insists on proportionate, humane policy. Protect life by strengthening supports that reduce the circumstances that lead to unwanted pregnancy and make parenting viable, while preserving the clear rule that the state cannot lightly commandeer another person's body. That balance honors dignity on both sides. It treats pregnant people as moral agents entitled to bodily integrity, and it treats fetal claims with the seriousness they deserve, without resorting to coercion that history and practical ethics show will do more harm than good.
Now, sanctity of life.
You began by invoking bodily autonomy as the organizing principle, and I accept its moral force. People have a strong claim to control what happens to their bodies. But the debate is not whether autonomy matters. It is about whether that claim always overrides every other moral claim in every circumstance. Your argument treats autonomy as absolute. My point is that moral life routinely recognizes competing rights and seeks principled ways to weigh them. You say the state must meet an extraordinary justification before it compels one person to use their body for another. If the presence of a distinct human organism gives rise to a serious moral claim, then that is precisely the sort of claim that qualifies as extraordinary, not something to be dismissed by fiat. We need a clear, non-ad hoc account of why the second life's claim is categorically weaker than the pregnant person's autonomy, and you have not provided one. Instead, you rely on a default presumption in favor of the pregnant person that quietly begs the question against all rival moral considerations. Your public health point is stronger. Restrictions that make care unsafe or delayed are a real moral and practical problem. But that problem proves my case, not yours. If policy choices increase avoidable harm, the proper response is to redesign policy to reduce harm while honoring compelling moral obligations, not to erase one of the obligations. Think of it like traffic safety. If a community's enforcement regime unintentionally makes walking dangerous, we don't stop protecting pedestrians. We change the roadway, add crosswalks, and invest in safe infrastructure. Similarly, we can protect unborn life legally while creating the clinical pathways, non-punitive exceptions, and timely access that clinicians need to provide safe care. On socioeconomic harms, you rightly emphasize, those effects demand massive social investment, prenatal care, paid leave, childcare, education, not a policy that treats them as mere externalities. If continuing a pregnancy predicts greater poverty or lower educational attainment, the moral response is to remove those structural barriers, because justice requires protecting both vulnerable pregnant people and vulnerable unborn persons. Your equity critique cuts both ways. Uneven access to services is an argument for expanding supports and reducing coercion, not for abandoning the unborn's moral claim. Finally, medicine and technology complicate bright legal lines, but complexity does not resolve moral questions by default. It requires careful rules that reflect both the biological reality of developing human life and the practical need for compassionate, timely clinical judgment. The public should be offered a coherent compromise: legal recognition of fetal moral worth, robust maternal and family supports, clear medical exceptions where necessary, and non-coercive services. That is not a denial of autonomy. It is a refusal to let a single principle bulldoze other profound moral claims. I ask them to explain why absolutist autonomy is preferable to a balanced policy that seeks to protect both lives and reduce real harms.
Moving on to the second rebuttals. Now, bodily autonomy.
I begin where we agree. The question of fetal value is morally serious and deserves respectful engagement. But agreeing that a developing human has moral worth does not automatically answer the key legal and moral question here. When may the state compel one person to use their body to sustain another? That is the threshold we keep asking my opponent to justify, and they have not supplied a clear administrable answer. Which precise criterion do they adopt? Fertilization, a neural milestone, viability, capacity for pain, and why that one rather than another? Biological continuity is real, but continuity is not moral equivalence. An acorn's continuous development into an oak does not mean we are required to house every acorn in a greenhouse and water it with our own bodies. If the state may override bodily autonomy whenever another being has some form of moral value, then bodily autonomy collapses into a secondary, easily overridden interest. And that is a radical reordering of moral and legal practice that requires explicit argument, not implication. Beyond theory, there is enforcement. What will policing, investigation, and prosecution look like under the approach my opponent urges? Any system that makes pregnancy outcomes criminally salient invites surveillance of intimate life, chills clinicians, delays care, and falls hardest on people with the fewest resources. These are not abstract risks. They are predictable consequences of transforming moral concern into compulsory law. My opponent insists we can have both: legal protection for the unborn and generous supports for families. But those two aims become mutually exclusive if the protection they mean is coercive. If sanctity of life is truly the priority, do they favor budgets and programs that materially reduce abortions? Universal prenatal care, paid parental leave, reliable childcare, accessible contraception, or do they favor criminal bans enforced through courts and police? Rhetoric without a commitment of resources is a moral promise that collapses at the point of implementation. Finally, complexity in medicine cuts both ways. Shifting biomedical markers make bright legal lines unstable, producing uncertainty for patients and clinicians alike. A humane, just policy recognizes competing rights and seeks proportionate responses. My position preserves the deep moral concern for fetal life while insisting the state may not lightly commandeer another person's body. In my closing, I will press the public to choose between two pathways: a coercive regime that punishes and surveils, or a compassionate strategy that protects bodily integrity and invests in the supports that make life and parenting viable. That is the real test of conscience and public policy, and it is one my opponent must answer clearly.
Now, sanctity of life.
You insist the right to control one's body is nearly absolute, and I accept that autonomy is a foundational moral claim. But the debate is not whether autonomy matters. It is whether it automatically nullifies the competing moral claim posed by another innocent human life. If every moral question were decided by the strongest single principle, moral reasoning would be trivial. We routinely balance rights. Freedom of speech does not allow libel, property rights do not permit killing, and personal liberty does not license grievous harms to others. Why should this case be exempt? Imagine a traffic rule that treated drivers' convenience as inviolable. We would call that reckless. We do not allow someone to drive into a crowd because it would be inconvenient to stop. The presence of another human being introduces a competing claim that demands moral weight. Your burden, rightly stated, is to show when and why the state may compel one person to use their body to sustain another. That burden is not insurmountable. It calls for principled, administrable standards, not rhetorical absolutes. If the unborn is a distinct human organism whose development is continuous and empirically observable, then the question is how to draw lines that respect both lives and clinical realities. Vague appeals to sentience or viability without operational rules produce the very uncertainty you criticize. But the solution is not to abandon protection altogether. It is to design a legal framework that recognizes fetal moral worth while maximizing timely, safe clinical pathways and robust exceptions for genuine medical emergencies. Your evidence about how restrictions can chill care and disproportionately harm the marginalized is sober and persuasive. I do not contest it. That is why a sanctity of life position must be paired with aggressive public investments, universal prenatal care, contraception access, paid parental leave, and supports for parenting. Doing so reduces the burdens you rightly enumerate and makes protection of unborn life humane rather than punitive. So the debate narrows to a practical choice: endorse an absolutist autonomy that permits ending any nascent human life at will, or adopt a carefully calibrated policy that treats unborn life as morally significant while also protecting pregnant people through timely medical exceptions and social supports. I ask you to explain why your preferred route, an absolute veto of legal protection, better secures dignity for vulnerable people than a compromise that holds both lives as worthy. In my closing, I will present that compromise as a concrete policy package: legal recognition of fetal worth, non-criminal medical exceptions, expedited clinical pathways, and comprehensive social investments. Ask yourself, which approach truly honors dignity in both persons, and which leaves the most vulnerable unprotected by default?
Finally, the closing statements from both sides. Now, bodily autonomy.
We agreed on the seriousness of unborn life. We treated that concern with respect. Where we diverge is whether that seriousness alone justifies the state compelling one person to use their body to sustain another. No moral intuition, however deep, removes the basic right to bodily self-determination. Imagine forcing someone to donate a kidney, to carry a pregnancy against their will, to accept medical risk and lifelong consequences because another has intrinsic value. That is the real test here. My position does not deny value, it assigns limits. Rights are meaningful only when they protect the vulnerable and the autonomous alike. The opponent has given us the moral claim. I have shown why law must protect the bodily sphere that makes moral agency possible. If we wish to respect life without destroying liberty, we defend the right of each person to control their own body. That is where justice, compassion, and practical governance meet.
Now, sanctity of life.
I accept that bodily autonomy is a powerful moral claim. Control over one's body matters deeply, but rights meet limits when they collide with another innocent human life. We have a continuous biological development from conception toward birth, and that continuity gives rise to a moral obligation to protect. My opponent correctly raised real concerns about coercion and hardship. I concede law must be paired with compassion, robust health care, child support, parental leave, and economic aid. Yet compassion does not erase moral lines. Treating human life as intrinsically valuable, rather than merely instrumental, shapes laws and institutions that protect the vulnerable and strengthen families. They argued autonomy should almost always prevail. I've shown why a principle that places an innocent life outside moral regard is neither coherent nor humane. We can honor both dignity and responsibility, protect the unborn, while supporting those who carry and care for the living.